Again, I want to welcome all of you here tonight for this latest in a series of meetings to mark the 50th anniversary of metropolitan government. What an exciting and really meaningful celebration it is, because 50 years ago, after an effort in 1958 to bring about one government, an effort that failed, the law required that both voters in the city and the county separately had to vote to merge into one government. But in 1962, of course, it became a reality. And I look around the room, many of you were there that day in June in front of the courthouse, tense there, sweltering day, when we recognized for the first time this 50th year. And I welcome you here tonight, not only on my own behalf, but also on behalf of my co-chairs for this 9-month-long celebration. My co-chairs, Thelma Harper and George Cate. We were asked by Mayor Carl Dean to serve as co-chairs of this event. And I know that in the latest of the series of meetings, Mayor Dean once more wants to add his own word of welcome. So I'll ask him, Carl, one more time, please come forward.
Well, thank you, John. First, let me say thank you to everyone who's here, and also to say, again, thank you to the co-chairs. George Cate and I go back to my days as public defender in the Stallman building, and we used to, before it was beautiful condominiums, we rode the elevators together. And George is just, I think, an extraordinary Nashvilleian, and certainly, I think, the friendliest person in all of Nashville, and has been so kind to my family and to myself, and I'm so happy about that. And Senator Harper, up here in red, always the best dressed person I know, an extraordinary member of our community. And Senator, thank you for the time you've put into this. And John, thank you for always being there when we ask for your help. Tonight will be a great night. We're honoring Mayor Phil Bredesen, and he's here with Andrea, and we're so happy that you're here and to be able to look back at your, I think, 8 extraordinary years as mayor and what you meant to the history of the city. Thank you for agreeing to be here. Mayor Purcell is with us too, and Bill, it's great to have you here again. But thank you all for being here, and I also want to acknowledge, because it's important to always have him happy, Bob Cooper, the Attorney General of the state, is here. Thank you, Bob, for being here. And I'll turn it back to John.
Thanks, John. Thanks very much, Carl. It has been a phenomenal 50 years, and looking back on it, you wonder, if you were here, how it ever happened. That 1958 controversy about Metro government, I mean, it was a tough political campaign that year. Mayor Ben West favored it. Mayor Beverly Briley favored it too. So both leaders of the city and county governments were for it. And in 1958, the voters of the city said yes, and the voters of the county said no, and so it failed. And we recounted that at that first meeting that hot day. And now we've come to this series of seminars in which we recount those very early days. First of all, we talked about that tough campaign in 1958, in some ways an even tougher campaign in 1962, where both city and county voted for it. We talked about Mayor West's vision for expanding the city after it failed in 1958. Never occurred to him that it would come back again, and he went through that period of annexation, 2 annexations of the city that somewhat changed the character of the city. And in some ways, as we've talked during the earlier meetings, turned some people in favor of metropolitan government who'd been against it. They didn't like being annexed without a vote, and they were, and they made it known in 1962 by saying yes to metropolitan government, and so the city and county governments merged. As Mayor Dean said, part of what our meetings here at the center each month have meant the opportunity to honor those former mayors. The first time we met, we honored the memory of Beverly Briley, our first mayor. As those of you will well remember who you were here last time, we honored Dick Fulton, and to come, we will again honor Bill Purcell. But tonight, we pay tribute to Phil Bredesen. I'd just like to take a moment before asking my two co-chairs to add their words of tribute. I'd just like to take a personal moment to reflect on my recollections of Phil Bredesen, because I can remember, I think I can remember the first time I was in my office at the Tennessean when he came to see me, and I think all he wanted was to be a book reviewer. And you know, if I had to, and I turned him down. And you know, that's so embarrassing to admit that. And, you know, Dolores is going to give me hell on the way home for admitting that. But I just have to say, sitting there at my desk in a little office, and he's across. I mean, last thing I ever thought was this guy's a politician. I mean, yeah, he knew how to shake hands, but that was about as far as you could get with him, you know. And then the next time I remember during that meeting, he said something about being interested in politics. I also remember saying one time to Jim Sasser, you know, there's a fella in town from Massachusetts who's interested in sort of looking in on politics, and I don't know whether Sasser never took the initiative or Phil never took the initiative. I never brought it up with Sasser again, and looking back on it, I'm probably glad that I didn't, because I think his reaction to Phil being a politician would be exactly like mine. Last thing in the world you could think of this fellow doing is running for public office. And then one day, I get a call from a man in Boston, an old friend from days in politics named Joe Napolitan. And he said, who the hell is Phil Bredesen? And I said, well, he's not a book reviewer. And Joe Napolitan was a political consultant. And he had written an article. As I remember it, in American Airlines magazine, 50 things I learned as a political consultant. He said, this fella called me on the phone, wants to come up here and talk to me about running for mayor of Nashville. And I said, Joe, just forget it. You know, I mean, he can't be serious. And the next thing I know, he's in. And the next thing I know, he's mayor of our city. And the next thing I know, he's governor of our city. And I think back on a relationship with him that has been really meaningful to me. And Dolores knows this better than anybody, how truly I admire him and respect him, and how deeply I have felt about our friendship. And you know, part of that has not been just who Phil Bredesen is. It's also, and I think this is true for all of you who know him, it's also the woman he married. I mean, Andrea, I know you got to leave a little early tonight, but she served with me in this building over a 2-year period on the Commission on the Future of the Judiciary, and I got to know her extremely well. All of you who have lived in Nashville know about her physical courage, her mental courage, her emotional strength. You know about the organization she founded. If she'd walked in, I'd have said, yeah, write books and and run for mayor. And she'd have been elected. But he was elected, and I think back on my relationship with him, and there are moments that I look back on, I treasure. I remember when he asked me to chair a commission on violent crime when it was a problem in the community, and his support that he gave to that initiative, and I think of so many other times when we met and talked. We didn't always agree on politics, but he candidly stated it. The one thing about Phil Bredesen is if you have a conversation with him, you're going to have exactly what he thinks. He's candid, he's forthright, he's honest, he's honorable, and then I don't go to a Predators game. I don't go to a Titans game. But what I think about Phil Bredesen and what he's meant to so many aspects of our city's growth and development, and beyond that, having spoken of Andrea's courage, I do also remember that it's because of Phil Bredesen that this state did not execute the first woman in 120 years, and I feel that deeply and personally. And so, Phil, for all you've meant to this city, my thanks to you and my appreciation for the friendship and particularly my admiration of you for marrying Andrea. And having said that, I want to give my two colleagues, Thelma Harper and George Cate, an opportunity to say a few words of their own. Thelma?
And I promise it'll only be just a minute. I remember when we didn't know what your name was. We'd never heard of anything. So we called him Breedenson. And we were concerned that he came into town with the Mercedes. We were a bit concerned about that because most of us use little trucks and stuff. But we took our time to see who he was and what was all about him, and we got to know him. We thought that he would do, first thing, he was going to be a congressman. Well, we thought he was going to be okay with that too. Then if he didn't take that, then we decided to work on him working for the mayor. We had a mayor that was interesting, that I just love, because he was different. Bill Bonner is different, you all. And it was good to, number one, to talk about, Bredesen was different from anybody else. He was just kind of silk. He was silk sharp, just really sharp. Some of us who came through this council, we had difficulties because nobody got anything that you wanted, and if you didn't do what the mayor wants you to do, then they worked on you. So I guess when I started to talk about what is Phil Bredesen, what is he, I guess the first thing I thought about was, well, he has a beautiful wife. And one of the issues that this little old man told me, he said, I just don't understand why the mayor does not have a wife. And I said, oh, he does. But why doesn't he call her name? What is her name different from his? So the rest of us, too, started wondering, well, why didn't he, are they married or were they just were they just well, did we find that, I mean, Purcell doesn't have a wife, and Carl doesn't have a wife. So people started to run, just to be a little bit, because my old daddy, when he was shacking up is what people called it, because he didn't have a wife. But we finally realized that it was a new day. But working with him was, for me, it was wonderful. Just one thing, I did not have to go and ask him, what did you have to do, because I was no longer in the council. So in other words, I could just call him and say, this is what I want from the state. I could bum him around a little bit. But I enjoyed the time that I was there, the time that he was there. And the only thing that you can say about him, he did not curse. A lot of us, we had to, in order to, but he never did. He didn't use dirty words and didn't push you around, and that was one of the things that I liked about you, because I grew up with boys, and boys just they know what to do, and when you're a girl, you know what to do too. But it was just really a joy just being with you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Thelma, and that's wonderful. And as Mayor Dean said, George Gate is our very first vice mayor. The panel discussions we've had, he's participated in. He's helped us remember how we got Metro. He's helped us remember how we started Metro. Tonight, we have a panel that talks about the impact of this new government on the black community. The vote of the black community, if you think about it, was substantially diluted. We'd be a different city in some ways if the vote had not gone as it did. George was there throughout those early days and remembers it so well. We're so indebted to him for so many things. George, I know you want to pay your own tribute to Phil Bredesen, and I know you want to introduce this panel. Thanks very much. Come forward.
Fellow committee members, John, Thelma,
Yes, sir.
and distinguished Nashvillians, this is a special pleasure for me. I was honored when I was told that I was one of a committee of 3 to make plans for this Metro at 50. And I think it's important for us to recognize that while this is a birthday party and a birthday celebration, we would have no reason to celebrate the birthday if the next 50 years hadn't turned out so well with such good leadership. And we recognize our part of that tonight. Now, we've got a series of slides we want you to see, which will depict something of what it was like when Phil Bredesen was serving as mayor. Let me add one personal note. I grew up in East Nashville and spent my summers and early fall either caddying on the Shelby Golf Course or hiking along the Cumberland River along the Shelby Greenway, which at that time was not a greenway. It was just the Shelby bottoms with rabbit trails. However, I attended, while Mayor Bredesen was mayor, his dedication of the Shelby Greenway and heard him say, this is one of the things that I most am pleased to do, is to dedicate something that is going to provide this sort of comfort and convenience to the citizens of this city and county for generations yet to come. I thought, if a mayor can turn my rabbit trails into a greenway, he is my kind of mayor. Now, you will see photographs to depict what it was like during Phil Bredesen's administration. We've been extremely fortunate in this community to have the kind of leadership we've had. It certainly applies to our mayors, members of the council, to committee chairmen of many boards and commissions. I pay special tribute to the members of the Charter Commission that wrote the charter for metropolitan government. And I think it is a tribute to Nashville. When I look down the list of those who are on the platform tonight, they are the next generation of some of those community leaders. You know, when you have great community leaders and the younger generation comes along and stays in Nashville, that's a lot to be thankful for.
Yes.
Phil Bredesen, we appreciate your leadership, appreciate what you did as mayor, what you have done since that time, and how you represent this community in a special way in the activities of our entire state. I called to your attention the material that has been passed out to you. You'll see the biographical information on our panelists and on the person who's going to preside as the moderator of the panel. And some of those things you may want to ask questions about, but that shows something of the caliber of people that we're working with and who are devoting their time and effort now to come back and help us celebrate the 50 years of the metropolitan government. Now, Phil, one thing, Mayor Bredesen, I am assigned to do, and that is to provide for you the disc of what we're showing on the screen right now. And it represents something that you can keep, go back and look at, enjoy doing that. And we want you to have this as a special keepsake of this evening. So if you'll come forward, I'll present this disc to you right now. Let's recognize Mayor Phil Bredesen.
It's a little discouraging to see how young and how much hair I had in those pictures before now. Just a couple of words. First of all, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I've seen some people here tonight I hadn't seen in a long time, and appreciate the opportunity. A couple of words about, first of all, about Metro. Metro government has been talked about in a lot of different ways, and a lot of times it's about the efficiencies you have, and there's no doubt there, the ability to combine a couple levels of government into one unit. I think just it works better to have a police department instead of a police department and a sheriff's department, and not have all that duplication is one of the reasons for that. But even more than that, just the idea of taking the entire city and making it part of one political unit. It's got one council, it's got one mayor. It lets you get things done. It lets you view the city in a sort of in a whole way that you lose when you have a city of, the city government and all these suburban governments around it. And certainly in my years as governor, you saw in a lot of other cities, both in this state and really around the country, some of the enormous advantages that there are to this idea of a really single unified government is a way to get things done. I was talking to somebody just earlier out in the hall when we went through a couple of things like, for example, talk about the Titans. I really do not think that would have been possible to achieve if we had had a city and county separate governments. I mean, it was something with so many moving parts and so many different issues that trying to resolve all those with multiple legislative bodies and multiple mayors and so on, I really think would have been impossible. So in just one of many ways, I think it really has been of enormous benefit to the city, and something which I've recommended to other mayors and other cities really across the country as I've gone and talked about it. When I saw these pictures, I also wanted to reflect for a moment on the sort of very early days of it. John, by the way, is exactly right. He did turn me down for a job as a book reviewer, and my career might have been very different if he had been, willing to give me a chance there. But he did, however, I did not get a job, but he did give me, however, 3 books that they had no intention of reading in the book review thing, which I was able to take home with me. And so I did not come away completely empty-handed from that effort. And John, I have to say thank you so much. Your friendship has meant a great deal to me over the years, and John is one of those people who sometimes when times got tough and you needed a little perspective or somebody to kind of help you think things through, John has always been there to talk with me, has always had good advice, and it's meant a lot. Thelma, I've enjoyed very much my relationship with you. At least 95% of the time. There's been a few in there when we sort of say, wait, what's going on here? But it really has been. I look at this change from being in the business world to politics. I look at it as a very important thing for me personally. Part of the reason that I really wanted to do it was I kind of woke up one day and I was 43 years old or something like that, and all my friends were white men, 44 years old, who were involved in the business world, which is a very different place than the town I grew up in, the small town I grew up in. And I think in a lot of ways, just getting into politics and just having such a much richer circle of people and much richer circle of issues than you do in these other worlds has been really important to me over the years personally. I just think it's made my life a lot better than it would have been just continuing on in that same vein. And George, I guess, he's right here, has standing behind me, has always, as John has had a chance to work with him over the years, work with him on some charter issues over the years, and has always been a great help and a provider, I think, of some perspective of the things you get involved with. I last of all just want to reflect a little bit on just how different things are today. And when you were talking with Thelma, talking about those early days, I remember it. For example, in that first campaign, as was pointed out, the fact that our names were different was actually a significant political issue. It now has become a political requirement, and whoever plans to run for mayor the next time had darn well better get his wife, if she's got his name, to change it to something else, and so on. There was also an issue of a big political issue was that if we elect a mayor from west of the river, East Nashville's never going to get anything again. I mean, I mean that in the sense of this very regional kind of within the city kind of feeling of, and I just don't feel, and you guys talk about it, but I just don't feel any of that kind of thing anymore. I mean, I really think we've kind of moved beyond that as a city, and really do see the city in that same sort of holistic way. I remember very well the first day coming into the office. This was my first elected office of any sort, and I sort of felt like, where we were about to sack Rome or something. Do I really belong here? And is it okay for me to open the door? I do remember that I showed up at the office with all the TV cameras following, and none of the cards worked to get in the office. I remember, and like this, and we'd been sort of completely locked out. So I actually did not get to work at 8 o'clock that morning, but about 8:30 after we got somebody over to actually open the doors for us. It was a great time. I have had the privilege, as two of the other people in this room have had, as serving as mayor of a really of a greatest American city. A very rewarding time in my own life, and to Nashville, congratulations on 50 years as Metro, and here's to 50 more and 100 beyond that. Thank you all very much.
Phil, I believe in providence, and I think it was providential. I have always heard that John Siegenthaler, as the editor of the Tennessean, was a real taskmaster. And I suggest that if in fact Phil Bredesen had become a full-time book reviewer on the staff of the Tennessean, he never would have been allowed enough time to run for mayor. So, John, we thank you for the rejection. And Phil, we thank you for your persistence. To change a community from a city and a county with a variety of people and interests, business interests, educational background, churches, schools, the kind of diverse population that Nashville and Davidson County had just prior to that date 50 years ago, when the people of this city and county voted yes for the adoption of Metro. It's a difficult thing for that to occur. And there are persons and influences and groups of people who are apprehensive about how their lives will be affected and changed by such a thing as a consolidation of city and county governments. One group, represented here well tonight and represented in this community exceptionally well, are the members of the African American community. Their feelings about the proposal to consolidate, their campaigning either for or against, their votes, and their roles that they played in the 50 years after Metro became a fact. They are a very significant part of what we celebrate, and it's extremely important that we try to understand what pressures they felt and what actions they took, how they campaigned, how they voted, and how they assess the result of 50 years of the metropolitan government. Tonight, Francis Guess, a well-known member of this community who has served in leadership roles in a variety of ways. If you look on the sheet that you've been handed, you'll see some of the things that he has done. Serving on the cabinet of the governor in 2 successive terms, playing major roles in human relations, locally, statewide, and in fact, nationally. We are happy, Francis, that you accepted our invitation to be the moderator of this group, because we expected you to ask the most challenging questions and not let them get away with anything. So you come forward, if you would, moderate this panel and put them to work, would you? Let's give him a hand.
Thank you, Mayor. Our topic tonight is the impact of Metro on the African American community. And I thought, while standing over there, it may be beneficial to look back on what was the context of the votes between 1958 and 62, what was going on in Nashville, and particularly what was going on in the African American community. And I think probably the best place to start is the State Fair, which is going on now, in 1959. And there was a young lady who recently came to Nashville from Chicago, Diane Nash, who attended the State Fair, and for the first time in her life encountered signs that said colored women and white women. And it was an insult and indignity that she had not seen before, and one that enraged her. It inflamed her. It motivated her to try and figure out why was this happening here in America. And as we all know, following her experience at the State Fair, and parenthetically, I might point out that the featured act at the fair that year was Gene Autry, and that he stayed at the Andrew Jackson Hotel. I just know these things. But what we do know is that as a result of getting enrolled in Reverend Lawson's nonviolent workshops at First Baptist Church, that it prompted the students to commence a series of sit-ins here in Nashville. And what occurred after that is we had a sit-in movement that shook this community. We then had the children, the members of the sit-in movement here in Nashville, going off to Highlander Folk School to get training down in Mount Eagle. They then left there and went to Shaw University in North Carolina to form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This was all occurring within the first 120 days of 1960. They came back that night only to discover the next morning that a member of what had been the Charter Commission and their attorneys, the Alexanders Luby, his home had been bombed, and they chose then in April to march downtown silently to confront Mayor West. And it was then that he said, as a man, he thought it was important that our lunch counters integrate. This was all occurring within the first 120 days of 1960. This was what was going on in Nashville then. And from that moment on, we saw a series of activities in our community which were led by the African American students and its leadership here in 1960 with the freedom rides that John has spoken of in many occasions in 1961, with the movement to try and still integrate our theaters in 1961-62, while during this entire period of time, the entire country was focused on the fact that the black community in Nashville has produced a leadership that was essentially changing the character of our country. We were focused on making America a different place, while at the same time, the leadership in Nashville was focused on making Nashville a different place. And what we had with the election in 1962 was the transformation of a city that essentially, undisputedly, it was discussed at the time, as Mary Kate has told us, as John has told us, was oriented toward being a black-controlled city. No doubt in anybody's mind about it. But at the same time, it was a city that was being confronted by the recognition that we have our black citizens here disrupting the social order of things. And so by looking at it in that context, I was wondering, as we still debate whether the Civil War was about slavery or states' rights, was the consolidation of our metropolitan government, John, about reform, or was it about race?
You know, Francis, it's not surprising from you. It's the core question, and there is no doubt in anybody's mind that in 1962 there were voices raised, not that dominant, but they were there, and they were saying it's going to be a black city. It's going to be a black-dominated city if you don't go for metropolitan government. But as those members of the council and George Cate said the last time we met here, race was not an outspoken dominant issue in the total community. There were those voices, and they did echo, but for the most part, outside the black community, it was not that much of an issue, that much of a threat. Mayor West had twice annexed to the old city, and both times had diluted the African American vote, and as George Barrett, who is here, said in a speech as Metro government approached, you can either, and he said it to some black leaders, he said, it seems to me that the future is that you can either make a difference with the new government and increase black participation in city council, or you can continue to be annexed and continue to have your vote diluted, and you'll be stuck in a greater minority position than you are right now. Was it about race? I don't think for the white community, for most of the white community, it even occurred to them. The 58 campaign had occurred. Mayor West had annexed without letting people vote on it. Then he annexed again and didn't let you vote on it. And then he put a $10 tax on every automobile, which was very, very unpopular. And if I had to ask what that campaign was about primarily, it was about, are you for Ben West or are you against Ben West?
What is-
And Mayor West had been for the metropolitan government, and then he was against the metropolitan government. If I had been in the black community, I think my perception would have been different. And as I'm sure is the fact, in Councilman Robert Lillett's district, there was strong opposition to it. As I am sure of the fact, if you lived in Z. Alexander Luby's district, there was strong support for it. We all might as well face it. It's reality. Most of the black vote in Nashville was opposed to metropolitan government, and given the dilution that was going to be inevitable, whatever Citizen Barrett had said, given that dilution, it's perfectly understandable. So I think it depended really more on where you lived, whether race was an issue.
It has been suggested, General Johnson, that the person most responsible on the Charter Commission for the enactment of our consolidation was your father, and that he was the one who had the greatest influence on Z. Alexander Luby. How did that occur?
Well, I think that as my father talked to me often about that whole debate and discussion, he and Mr. Luby, I think, had a very close relationship in the sense that they had a great deal of respect for one another, and my father always talked with a great deal of respect for Mr. Luby, and he said they had a conversation, or they had several conversations, where the point that he made was not unlike what George Barrett was saying, but that yes, the political power was going to, in the old city of Nashville, the African American community would at some point certainly be dominant. But at the end of the day, what would they really be dominant of? Would the city be a vital city, or would it be a dying city? And I think that Mr. Luby saw that he was looking out into the future. He wasn't looking 5 or 10 or even 15 years. I think he was looking and felt that it would be better for the community as a whole, and that included the African American community, if Nashville were metropolitan, were consolidated, and that progress, that would lead to a more prosperous community of which everyone would benefit. Maybe not to the same degree, but that had a better chance of providing for the future of that current generation at the time and generations that were yet to come. And I think that was my father's feeling, and I think he eventually was able to convince Mr. Luby that was the better choice to be made.
Reverend Love, your father came into the Metro City Council in 1951. He was the newest member as a result of the annexation that John spoke of. From your conversations with him, was he for or against the consolidation of the government?
From what I can recall, I think it was a question of inevitability. Luby was not for it. And you had 3 black council members. So who's going to be the deciding vote? Who's going to be the one that goes against what it seems as if the whole city is going to do? I think even reading Robert's rules, it says that sometimes just because you second a motion doesn't mean you're for it. You just want to get a discussion. So voting for the merger with the hopes that maybe the promises that were made about equal districts was what was on his mind. It's, I think, odd we bring the question up of what kind of city would it be? It'd be an African-American city with an African-American as mayor. And what then would that mean to the civil rights struggle, particularly with the fact that you had the number of HBCUs in that region at the time. And so I know that's beyond the question, but I think it's important, considering my father's position as National Alumni Association president for Tennessee State for 6 years, understanding he taught at Fisk, and knowing what it meant to have some power politically at that particular time.
Dewey, listening to Reverend Love pointed out that it would be an African-American city with an African-American mayor. As chairman of the Metro Charter Revision Commission, would you recommend a recension of the Metro Charter and let us have our city back?
Boy, that's a loaded question. No, I wouldn't. Not at all. And you know, Francis, you raised really an interesting question from the get-go, and you kind of have to step back a little bit and remember, as you say, what was going on even before the 58 vote and the 62 vote. Were it not for the race question, there's a very good likelihood that there never would have been an enactment by the state legislature that would have allowed city and county governments to consolidate. When that was going through the legislature, thank you, when that was going through the legislature, there were a number of southern rural white men who were in favor of allowing metro government to form because of the fear that Nashville was going to have a black mayor. And that was part of the selling point for these rural white men was Nashville's got an intelligentsia associated with Fisk, Meharry, what was then Tennessee A&I, now Tennessee State, and that other cities didn't have that. And so if you don't allow this dilution, you will not be able to stop an African American from becoming mayor of Nashville. So going back to what allowed the state enactment that resulted in the passage of the metropolitan allowing legislation, that was a big part of that.
Senator Harper, we keep hearing that this was all George Barrett's fault. Thank you, George. But Senator Harper, the question is put to you. Was this consolidation about reform, about economy, about efficiency, or was it about race from your perspective?
Well, I'll have to go back and just look where we were. When you all went to the fair, you all didn't realize that there was a black place, and there was a white place. Not all of us could do wherever we wanted to do. That was a time when black women, they worked in somebody's kitchen. And they were not thinking of, so politics was really not that interesting. We were trying to get our children in school. We were just trying to see we were going to live. During that time, the young people, and thank the Lord it was young people doing that, because older people were scared to death of what was going to happen to them as young people were when they were going whatever. They were just afraid to death. They were too afraid, because their jobs depended on what they did. So when we think about now, where we are now, and where we were then, most of us were concerned about what was happening to our children. Even the little children, what was going to happen to them, what was going to happen to the husbands. Because think about it, at that time we didn't have just jobs. You didn't have any real jobs. Not really jobs. Well, at Fisk you probably could, but think about it. During that time, what was your granddaddy doing? What was our daddies doing? So when we talked about when we talk about politics, sometimes people just didn't know what they were talking about. We just didn't have any idea what was going on. And that's why when you mention about in certain areas where they didn't vote, they're scared. We were still in a position where we afraid. So some of them, the fact that they went ahead and changed it, when you think about the first time, people were afraid. Black people were afraid. When the second time, when it came around, there were some people who thought, well, maybe we could go ahead and do this. Because we really didn't, when we talk about a black city and a white city, we never thought that we were going to have a black city. Not to have for a mayor, that was not anything we'd ever talked about. Because we knew that white folk were always going to take care. They were always run whatever was going on, that they would take care of it. Not for us. We never, I don't think all of those years, I never heard anybody thinking about a black mayor. We almost didn't know what a mayor was. So the real issue of why we voted the way we did, sometimes because we just didn't know what we were supposed to do. Some people who, I have to say it just right, because there was people who thought they were uppity. Y'all know what that means?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. But the others felt like you all was something wrong with you, because we knew where our place was, and we knew if we could stay there, we would never have to worry about doing any real issue things. So when we thought about what was happening with the government, we never felt that we would ever get a job anyway. We never thought we'd get a job from Metro. Well, sometimes we have a problem now getting there, but so there's a difficulty. Everybody had a difficulty getting a job. And with Metro, at that time, we didn't feel anything was going to happen for us anyway. But just a little by little, we started having something. We always had one who would have a halfway decent job, but you would have others who felt that we'd never be at that point. So one of the things that much in our community, we're concerned about what was happening to our children. You know, what really we were going to do to our children. And that's when we started with that, and then we'll go back to busing. It's kind of the same thing. We were always concerned about what was happening to our children. But thank goodness that we had Miss Nash and all of those young people who were not afraid. We'd still have a problem right now.
Senator, let's ask Dewey then, from an education perspective, had we not enacted metropolitan government, would our school board have continued to wage its battle against school desegregation in this community?
Unfortunately, I think you would see that. And all you have to do is look at Memphis right now and the controversy that's going on between the city and the county schools. And again, it's an interesting end result for those who wanted consolidation in order to dilute the African American influence. When you merge the city and the county schools, then you had to deal with those issues because you no longer had separate school systems. You no longer had a county and a city school system. So again, the consequences that they didn't intend, their motives may have been wrong, but the end result was good.
John, it is suggested that Solomon Evans hated Ben West, and Ben West obviously was very instrumental in moving the Metro vote along. Why does Solomon Evans hate Ben?
I think hatred is too strong a word. I really don't think that Solomon Evans hated anybody. Well, maybe
Okay.
maybe Boss Crump, but but the relationship between Ben West and Silman Evans really related to Silman Evans' support of Tom Cummins as mayor, who was a reform mayor, who was defeated by Ben West. And that was a sort of a traditional evolution. The interesting thing about the question as you posed it to me, Francis, is that in this election, and we had been through civil rights demonstrations and was struggling with trying to decide whether the city was going to obey the law of the land or fight it. And from the outset, Silman Evans' paper said we must obey the law of the land. Separate but equal is not constitutional. It's unconstitutional. And we must support that. And across the hall, the Nashville Banner, owned by Jimmy Stallman, took exactly the opposite position and said, and fought change, fought integration, and I think it's fair to say every day and every week fought integration. Interesting thing, again, is that Ben West and the Banner in this election were together, 1962, against metropolitan government. 1958, the election, they had both been for it. Ben had decided annexation was the way to go, and the Banner went with them. And when you talk about race, I don't think you get away from the fact that Ben's position on race, his friendship for Mr. Luby, his friendship for Bob Lillard, for Councilman Lillard, and I think his friendship for Councilman Love was one thing, but there was no friendship at the Nashville Banner for any one of those three people or anybody else who was in. So you had cross currents of political sentiments here, and looking back on it, it's very, very tough to explain how people came down where they were in the final election. I look back on it, and despite what my friend Barrett would have advised me to do, if I'd been a member of the black community, I would have been hard pressed, I think, to go with Mr. Lillard and against Mr. Luby. And I think while Mr. Luby carried boxes in his own district, carried Pearl High School, carried Dudley Park, most of the black community voted, whatever he said, most of the black community voted against metropolitan government. Now, it was close. It was not just a runaway election.
But wasn't there also
it was a hotly contested race. And the thing that makes it interesting to me, Francis, is that there were people together. There were allies in that election who were hostile to each other on many other points of view, including race.
But wasn't it also a fact that the turnout in the black community, for some of the reasons that Senator Harper may have alluded to, was extremely suppressed during that election and was not necessarily a reflection of had they been willing, because there was a lot of upheaval in our town at that time, particularly around the issues of race. There was fear, as Senator Harper pointed out.
I think that's right.
So to look at the absolute numbers, could we say that it reflected the attitude of the black community, or did it reflect the fear of reprisal?
No, I think Thelma Harper is right. Senator Harper's got our fingers on the pulse of it, and I think there's no doubt there was a suppressed vote. And the interesting thing, if you look at the subsequent elections, in most situations, you would have thought metropolitan government, which assured that we're not going to have a black-dominated community. That was not the intent of it. The intent of it was to provide better services. But if you look at it, the effect of it, that's what it was. And then when you look at how it's implemented, you find you've doubled the number of city councilmen. the number of districts go from 3 to 6. Now, one of those districts did not have a black candidate, and it was won by the first woman in metropolitan government. Frances Doyle won that district. But you go from 3 to 5 black councilmen, and the members of the Charter Commission, Dewey's father and Tory's father, both approached that 1962 Charter Commission knowing we've got to do something to increase black participation in the government, and so they doubled the number of members of council.
And they also doubled the size of the council.
And they did indeed, that's right.
So essentially it was a wash.
Yeah, the percent.
We
stayed-
had 3, we went to 6.
But the percent stayed essentially the same.
Yes.
Because you had some African Americans who ran in majority districts, but because there were so many African Americans running, then the Caucasian candidates ended up winning.
Exactly. They got in the runoff and then won.
Looking at the impact, General Johnson, and trying to think ahead, one of the pivotal moments in our history was construction of Interstate 3.6 miles, I-40 through North Nashville. Do you think that still would have occurred without metropolitan government?
I don't have any idea. I'd have to defer to
John?
John or someone like that, because that was really at a time when I wasn't, really.
I remember it, and I remember the Tennessean came out in favor of moving the plan to the river. The only other person in town I know that opposed it, because we were attacked by the Chamber of Commerce for taking that position. The only other person who came out in a white community who favored it was Alexander Hurd, the Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. But you're right, Francis, that was a very hot issue, and I would have to say, if this had been a community presided over by a black mayor, that destruction of that business community never would have occurred.
As is our custom, we want our audience to participate as much as possible. It struck me, John, during your introduction that one of the things I most appreciate about metro government is that I doubt very seriously, without metropolitan government, Nashville would have been blessed with 3 carpet-bagging damn Yankee mayors. So we are grateful for metropolitan government. We're going to open this up for the audience. I'm sorry, Mama. We're going to open this up for the audience. Are there any questions? We do have some mics, don't we?
I hope. Yes,
Yes.
we do.
Questions of the panel from the audience?
Are they afraid?
Dr. Bodenhammer?
I'm Arnett Bodenhammer. I'm probably one of the oldest African Americans present here. I can remember Nashville from many years ago. I can remember Jefferson Street as a youngster, teenager, and I just wonder, with metropolitan government, how most of the other areas have been successful in some way except North Nashville and Jefferson Street. I can remember Jefferson Street flourishing, being a very viable area, but now it seems that we get very little economic development in North Nashville, and I would just like for some of you to talk about it.
Dewey?
Well, I think, Francis, your question about the interstate was probably the most destructive thing that could have happened to the Jefferson Street corridor, that split it in half, ruined access from one area to the other. And I think you hit the nail on the head. If there had not been metropolitan government, if Nashville had continued to grow the way that it was, that you would have likely had a much stronger African American voice in the old city of Nashville that may have stopped the interstate from going through, and you wouldn't have seen that type of destruction. So I do think that you're correct that it hasn't grown, but there's, I think, a very specific reason why, because you split it in half when you ran the interstate through it.
Well, Senator A. Von Williams worked diligently trying to assure that we could get it was the community was taken care of. That the thing that we've had, they had worked hard, but there was nothing. There was like nothing we could do. He worked hard. I know he was one of the ones that worked diligently trying to assure that Jefferson Street would be made whole. It'll never be unless we stop unless we move the thing now. It will never be whole.
And we needed someone like a Victor Johnson, who I can tell you, Cecil has told me on many occasions the impact that he had on ensuring when they were drawing the district lines that there would be African American representation, and fought for that. And it was kind of unusual. Here is this man who'd come down from the north who did not have a segregationist bone in his body, and he's one of the ones that went to great lengths to ensure that you had that type of representation on the original council, because Harold, as you know, and as your father would know, it would not have taken a lot of gerrymandering or moving around of those district lines, and you wouldn't have had 5, potentially 6 African American councilmen. You might have had 2, but they worked to ensure that happened. So I guess on the destruction of Jefferson Street, where were the Victor Johnsons at that time?
Well, he was there, but it was sometimes one of the things that, if you've ever worked around somebody's home, sometimes you hear exactly what's going on. So some of the issues, they never came publicly. It was just, it was private. So
it has been suggested that, and this is one of the dilemmas of the African American community and one of the byproducts of that period between 1960 and 1965, 66, it has been suggested that the routing of the interstate by that time was solidified by what became known as Operation Garden Plot, but an effort by the United States Army to essentially control and contain the African American community during civil disturbances. And I think there's been a lot of literature on that as it related to an activity of the Department of Defense. It was reminded it was a defense highway, and that obviously, as a matter of fact, now that I think about it, under Operation Garden Plot, you'd be amused to discover in 68, 69 that of the priority, there were 19 priority cities in the United States. 4 of them were in this Army district: Atlanta, Memphis, Miami, Florida, and Nashville, Tennessee, had been at the highest level of concern by the Army for civil disturbance. So there may have been very little we could have done about that. Representative Love?
I think as you look at that map, it wasn't until the 90s that my father had 21st Avenue cut through, right there where Citizens Bank is now. Mm-hmm. And so you look at that, you're talking about 1990, to have that cut through. So from that time the interstates were put in, all that time I-40 comes and cuts off Meharry and Fisk from the other side. And my father's family's house was actually on the side of Scoville Street right there. So you're talking about that area was cut off literally until the 90s to even go some other place other than over the interstate, and then loops back around and cuts Tennessee State off from the other end.
And by the way, I'm not really that well read. The only reason I know about Garden Plot is I was a military intelligence analyst at the time. There's nothing complicated about my recollections. Are there any other questions? And I'll make a parenthetic observation about that. At the time we were doing that, the U.S. Army was maintaining surveillance on civil rights leaders, and we didn't think anything about it. We just thought it was part of the American way. And once it was eventually revealed by the commercial appeal, and we went back and looked at it, people were astonished that that was what the United States Army was engaged in at that point in time. But there's a lot of literature on that.
Francis, if I may, one more time, let me go back to Jefferson Street. When I was a 16-year-old, there were 4 black-owned grocery stores on Jefferson Street,
Right.
from 28th to 12th Avenue. There were 5 black-owned drugstores or pharmacies on Jefferson Street. All of that's gone. There's no economic development in that North Nashville area. Now, I'm talking about the old city of Nashville, and it stopped at 23rd and Hyman, somewhere in there. And there was only 2 through streets. I think it was 18th, and which is now D.B. Todd. But I also remember Hillsborough Road, when there were only a couple of retail stores on Hillsborough Road across from Hillsborough High School.
And all of that is in the record. I went back today and looked at the record of the I-40 steering committee. And all that's in the record as to the impact it was going to have on the community, the destruction it was going to do to the businesses, the economic benefit that would accrue to white-owned businesses north of that area. It was all in the court record, and the court still felt compelled to. The only wise thing they did was left Mayor Briley, or the Sixth Circuit put Mayor Briley back in the case. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'm Jimmy Larkin.
Go ahead, stand up, Jimmy, and then we can hear you better.
Just want to ask a question to the panel. Could help me out, please. Prior to metropolitan government, there was more or less separate but equal in the black community as far as business is concerned.
Hold the mic up, Jimmy.
And
Would you begin again?
yeah, prior to the merger of the metropolitan government, there was a separate but equal in the black community, whereas black businesses survived because of the black community. But under the metropolitan government, and even under the last 50 years of celebration of the metropolitan government, is there a diversity that's being done to promote black businesses?
Well, ironic to the panel, who I have an answer, but I'm not on the panel. Well, the point I would make, and we were talking about this the other day, is that according to Forbes magazine, Mayor, that Nashville is the #3 city in the United States for minority entrepreneurs. Period.
So,
And it was followed by Atlanta and Baltimore. Period.
And you have to remember what was happening at this time, too, when the charter was coming in. You had Brown versus Board of Education that had only been decided 5 years before in 1954, so no one really knew what the ultimate impact of doing away with the old separate but equal designation, what impact that would have. It was still very new. We can look back now and see, but in that time no one had heard of busing. I mean, busing was a product of really 1970 and beyond. So it was really too early at that time, I think, for people to know what changes would be brought about by doing away with the separate but equal.
Jimmy,
I'll just add one word to that. And I agree totally, Dewey. There was one manifestation of brown, though, that had already taken place, and white flight had already begun to occur. And when you talk about the business development of the suburbs, a lot of that had to do directly with a decision by an awful lot of people. School desegregation is going to affect, and I'm heading for suburbia. That was taking place already before metropolitan vote. It was taking place when the '58 vote occurred, and it was, and the flight was well underway by the time we voted on the metro in 1962.
And Jimmy, I was somewhat disingenuous in my response by citing the Forbes article, because you have to read, one, the fine print, and two, my response to your question. And part of what you're looking at is minority business as opposed to African American business. See, you asked me about African American business. I gave you a response about minority business. And that is a function, and I think Mayor Bretson would know more about this, and this is something I know very little about, but that at some point in time, Nashville was designated a gateway city. And as a result, there has been the introduction of refugees who ironically have a propensity for self-employment. And so when they went back and looked at Nashville, it was because of those two factors that we rose to the top of being a vibrant community for minority businesses. Did I get that right, Mayor Bredesen? Yeah.
So the issue really is not to say that if there was a black mayor, would there be a guarantee that you would have black contractors working on all the projects? Would there be more diversity if you had not merged the city and the county? Would you have these discussions about needing studies to find out whether persons are being employed fairly? Would you need guarantees or MOAs about 20% or 30% or 40% on jobs? I think that's the question that needs to be asked out there.
Yeah, and I think when we look at that, when we correspond what went on in Nashville, one of the glaring examples, obviously the impact on metropolitan government, is the correlation between when we saw what was going on in Atlanta and Maynard Jackson making a whole lot of black millionaires with the construction of his airport, and Nashville at the same time, which I doubt very seriously would have happened if we had had more black influence. We gave our airport away. Just gave it away. And I think when we looked at the consolidation vote, it was also suggested, John, given the unique relationship between the Evans family and their creation of American Airlines, that one of the prizes Silliman wanted to make sure he can maintain control of was the airport, which was subject to part of that annexation.
No doubt about it.
No doubt about it. And no doubt about the time has come for, where did Tam? She was throwing her finger across her throat a few minutes ago.
No, she just wanted you to stop talking.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. General Williams, you get the last question.
Thank you, Commissioner. Vincent Williams, I think I heard a speaker say something that I think I heard at least one of the political parties say about the current president, and it was the suggestion that if Nashville was going to have a black mayor, then the white community in Davidson County would have tried to make sure that that leadership and that the Nashville that was led by that black mayor would fail. And is there still a substantial sentiment of that kind in Nashville the Nashville community 50 years later?
I'm sure one of you lawyers understood that question. I didn't.
I think what the point was, because I think it may have come from Tory, let me defend you on this one. I think the question that came from, that he was responding to, was what his father had conversations with Alexander Luby about. Yes, you may have an African American mayor, but if we don't consolidate, what will be left of the city? Because, as John pointed out, you already had flight out of the city into the suburbs. It was not, if we elect an African American mayor, we're going to make sure he fails. It was more, you may have the opportunity to elect a mayor, but what's going to be left of the city when you do that? Because everybody's going to move to the suburbs. I think that's probably a more accurate assessment.
Yeah, I don't think there was any suggestion that there was going to be any deliberate effort for the city mayor to if it was African American to not be successful. But the political reality and the economic reality was that these two entities would really be both would be weaker than if they were combined into one city-county government, and not only from the efficiency standpoint, but I think a lot of what we look around today, and all of us have had, varying degrees of experience in seeing the city grow from different periods of time. But I don't think any of that would have been possible. Not that the city would have just dried up and blown away, but I think that the feeling was that the growth and the economic development would be substantially greater with the two governments combined. But not that there was any deliberate attempt to undermine the success of an African American mayor.
And could I just add that if you, excuse me, don't go for it. Go ahead.
I put one of the things that I think we need to understand, that black businesses, particularly in North Nashville, that they're slowly but surely just swelling away. Because what do you have to offer? We have the what is the dollar store? Dollar store. That's about it.
Yeah.
That's after a while, it appears that we are allowing them to fall by the wayside, and then after a while, somebody else is going to take it along, and it's going to be a booming community. That's exactly what the thoughts are.
Mr. Siegenthaler?
Yeah, just one, just to follow up a little bit on what Tori said. I just ask you to think for a minute. Put yourself in the position of Ben West. This issue about consolidation comes up in 1958, and he's for it. And I will tell you, he did everything he could to make sure the inner city, he was mayor of, went for it. And the inner city went for it. Inner city voted for it. The county voted against it. We don't want to be part of Nashville. Inner city voted for it. Ben West never thinks it's going to come up again. But he's a visionary and says, this city's got to grow. And I'm going to annex it. And I can annex it by a vote of the council. I don't have to ask the people about it. I can just annex it. And he has to annex it because what Tori said, economically, the city's got to have a tax base that can survive. And what he does, first of all, is takes a strip, as George has reminded us in previous meetings, takes that strip that's business oriented, going to be a tax base. And then the second annexation is high rent districts, high rent residential. He's doing that to build the base of the city. He's not trying to dilute the vote in the process. It's inevitable that that's what he does. Now, I didn't support Ben West as mayor, but I will tell you he was a visionary. Having been defeated at what he wanted to do, he was now going about it in the best way he knew how. Of course, what he did in the process was turn all those people he annexed without a vote against him. And they consolidated metropolitan government in order to get rid of him.
Yeah.
And you also have to keep in mind, all this was pre-Baker versus Carr with apportionment, one man, one vote, and it would have been much easier at that time, again, to have diluted the African American districts. You could have done it with impunity. And I think that's another factor that we sometimes forget now because we're so far beyond the one man.
And if I could
vote.
just add one other word that ought to be said.
Mr. Siegenthaler, this is your house.
This is my my house. Well, I'm going to speak of your father.
Yes, sir.
I'll speak of Mr. Luby, and I'll speak of Bob Lillard. In terms of political acumen, in terms of intellect, in terms of commitment to this community, they matched any other member of the council before or after. They were real leaders, and they provided real leadership.
And I think, let me add this piece there. That's one thing that I think hasn't come up in discussion. What happens in a city when you don't have a council member at large elected for 37 years? Now, you had an African American elected in 1912, and there wasn't another elected till 1950. Then you don't have a council member at large elected under the new government until 1999. So what happens to, I'm glad my nephew's here, he's sitting next to my mother, so he can remember this moment. When we talk about this transition, what happens to young African Americans who want to be involved in the process of governing and making their city better when they don't see the hope? Because in 1961, it's Nashville and Davidson County, and there's a promise made that even though we're going to annex and merge and put together, that there's a chance that you can have more representation. We're going to draw some districts. They're going to be majority minority. And the next day after the vote, when you decide to run for office, you end up with a wash because you have the same percentage. So what happens? So for 37 years, no one is able to compel the entire city to put their trust and confidence in an African American male or female until 1999. So then the question has to be asked, what happens to the dream deferred? What happens to those who want to get out there and get involved when they don't see anybody with a possibility? That's my concerning
Miss
question.
Kitty Smith, do you remember she was?
And I think part of that question goes to the fact, in looking at an at-large race, that Nashville is one of the largest cities in the United States. It's 543, I think, square miles. That you find it extremely much more difficult. I think, there were a lot of issues we did not discuss. Obviously, we didn't get into the other little satellite cities like Belle Meade and Oak Hill, and we didn't get into Goodlettsville. And the one thing we didn't get into was the impact all of that had in terms of their view toward Metro was the Hall state income tax, because they had such a dedicated, unencumbered source of revenue that the rest, that Bardo did not have.
But something else, Francis. When we talk about what about women that ever, we hadn't had a woman at large until Joanne North, and that was just recent, really. So women had the same problem that black folk had. That they didn't think we were, well, in other words, they just figured we weren't good enough.
As I indicated at the start of this program, at least I started with a question: was it about reform, efficiency? This vote we had in 1962 is the one we focused upon tonight, or was it about race? I think each of us can make our own conclusions. I'm not hesitant or shy of saying that my assessment of it has been and will remain both. I think it had a little of each element involved, and that each individual who supported it, voted for it, was motivated by either one, the other, or both of those motivators. And I do think at the same time that the end result is we have a city that we can understandably be proud of. And I think we have a city that we can understandably recognize that the African American community has paid a much higher price to enjoy. Any other thoughts from anyone?
I have one thought.
It's your house.
Next time we meet, we're going to talk about education and Metro, and hope you'll all come back and tell your friends, and we'll honor another mayor.
And I would like to end by saying that little crack I made about the damn carpet bag and Yankee mayors, that was just a joke. Just a joke, Mayor. We adjourn.
Be with you always.